You don't test a fortress by knocking down the man who built it. The words were never spoken out loud, but they might as well have echoed across the concrete parade ground the moment Lieutenant Carter Blake stepped forward and blocked the old man's path. The afternoon sun hung high over Fort Ridgeline, heat shimmering above the asphalt, the American flag snapping hard in a dry crosswind that carried the faint scent of diesel and cut grass. The base was in the middle of a full security readiness drill, barriers raised, secondary gates sealed, response teams staged at intervals measured in yards and seconds. Every movement was being evaluated, every lapse recorded, and Blake, 27 years old with a spotless uniform and something to prove, had no intention of being the weak link. The old man had approached the auxiliary checkpoint without hesitation, walking with a slow but steady gait, a faded canvas jacket resting loosely on his narrow shoulders. His white hair shifted in the wind, and his pale blue eyes scanned the perimeter towers not with confusion, but with quiet calculation. Blake saw only a civilian out of place. "Sir, this area is restricted during lockdown protocols," he said sharply, stepping into the man's path. "You need to turn around immediately." The old man stopped. He didn't argue. He didn't flinch. He simply looked past Blake toward the reinforced steel barrier that had descended moments earlier with mechanical precision. "Your timing's off," he said calmly, his voice low and weathered like river stone. Blake stiffened. Around them, a handful of soldiers slowed their stride, sensing friction. The drill was designed to simulate unauthorized entry under pressure. No second chances. No assumptions. Blake took a firmer tone. "Identification. Now." The old man reached slowly into his jacket, movements deliberate, unthreatening. From an inside pocket he withdrew a thin, worn leather sleeve. Not a driver's license. Not a standard visitor pass. It held a laminated card, edges softened by decades. Blake glanced at it and frowned. The text was faded but still legible. Protocol Architect, 1983. Blake's jaw tightened. This isn't valid credentialing. He gestured toward two nearby military police trainees observing the checkpoint. "Escort him back beyond the perimeter." The trainees hesitated, unsure, but stepped forward. The old man did not resist as Blake guided him aside with a firm hand to the shoulder, positioning him clear of the gate's shadow. Gravel shifted under boots. Radios crackled softly with coded updates. Overhead, the distant thrum of a Black Hawk idling at 200 feet blended into the rhythm of the bass. What Blake did not see was Corporal Noah Hayes watching from 20 yards away. Hayes had been monitoring the camera feed tied to the older sections of the installation, the ones few officers visited anymore. He had noticed something odd when the old man approached. He never once looked lost. He looked familiar. Hayes stepped closer, eyes narrowing at the laminated card now dangling loosely from the man's hand. "Sir," Hayes said carefully to Blake, keeping his voice measured. "Maybe we should call this up the chain before we finalize the report." Blake's expression hardened. "It's a drill, Corporal. We don't escalate civilians." The old man's gaze shifted to Hayes. There was no fear there, only a quiet patience. Somewhere inside the command building less than a mile away, three generals were concluding a closed-door briefing about the evolution of Fort Ridgeline's layered defense system. Outside, under a sun that revealed every flaw in concrete and character alike, the man who had designed that very system stood calmly within it, waiting. The wind shifted slightly across the parade ground, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of heated railings and sun-baked concrete as Lieutenant Carter Blake folded his arms and watched the old man with growing irritation. The drill timer continued to count upward on the digital display mounted above the checkpoint. Bright red numbers ticking off seconds in disciplined silence. Corporal Noah Hayes stood still beside the secondary barrier, his gaze lingering on the laminated card that read Protocol Architect, 1983, the letters faded but unmistakable. "Sir," Hayes said again, more carefully this time. "This installation went through a structural overhaul in 1984. That would have been the foundation year." Blake exhaled sharply. "It was 4 decades ago, Corporal. We are not verifying antiques during an active lockdown exercise." The old man adjusted the sleeve of his jacket, revealing a wrist marked with faint scars that looked less like accidents and more like history. He glanced toward the surveillance tower rising nearly 60 feet above the east perimeter. "Camera 3 is angled 2 degrees too far left," he said quietly. You have a blind wedge between the outer fence and the gravel trench. Hayes blinked. Blake scoffed. That system is digitally calibrated. The old man's pale blue eyes never left the tower. It was when I designed it. The statement landed softly, but it carried weight. Hayes felt it immediately. The tone was not defensive. It was factual. In the command building, less than a mile away, a large digital map of Fort Ridgeline covered an entire wall of the secure briefing room. Colored overlays highlighted response times measured in seconds and coverage arcs measured in degrees. General Robert Kincaid stood at the head of the table, hands clasped behind his back, while General Stephen Maddox and General Henry Cole reviewed the final readiness metrics. The briefing had one purpose: to honor the architect of the base's layered defense model, the man whose Cold War-era blueprint still formed the spine of the modern security doctrine. Outside, the subject of that briefing stood beneath the sun, unrecognized. A radio on Blake's shoulder crackled. Checkpoint Alpha report status. Blake pressed the transmit button. Minor civilian deviation during drill. Situation contained. The old man turned slightly, observing the reinforced hydraulic bollards embedded in the asphalt. Your secondary barrier cycle is running at 5.8 seconds, he said calmly. It was designed for 5.2. Blake felt his composure tighten. Sir, you are done evaluating anything. This is not a museum. Hayes stepped forward, lowering his voice. Lieutenant, respectfully, we should at least notify operations. If he is who he says he has not said anything. Blake interrupted. The old man finally met Blake's eyes directly. There was no challenge in them. Only patience. You are testing response, he said evenly. But you forgot something. Hayes swallowed. What is that, sir? The old man looked past them both, toward the distant command building gleaming in the afternoon light. The system was never meant to keep people out, he said. It was built to recognize who belongs. At that exact moment, inside the briefing room, General Kincaid's executive aide leaned toward him and whispered a name. The general's posture changed instantly, subtle but unmistakable, like a switch thrown behind steel doors. The red digital map continued to glow on the wall, unaware that the architect of its design was standing within its perimeter, quietly measuring every flaw. Inside the secure briefing room, the air shifted in a way that could not be measured by instruments or displayed on digital maps. General Robert Kincaid did not raise his voice when the aide finished whispering, but the muscles along his jaw tightened with controlled precision. Repeat that name, he said quietly. Elias Monroe, sir. He is at Checkpoint Alpha. For a brief second, the red and blue overlays on the wall seemed irrelevant, reduced to colored lines on a screen. General Stephen Maddox straightened slowly. General Henry Cole removed his glasses and set them down with deliberate care. No one in that room needed an explanation. The defense matrix of Fort Ridgeline was not simply a design. It was a doctrine, and the man who authored it had once warned them that the system would only remain effective if it remembered its own origin. Outside, under the open sky, the drill siren completed another cycle, a rising and falling tone that echoed across the 2 square miles of reinforced infrastructure. Lieutenant Carter Blake shifted his weight, irritation hardening into something less certain. Corporal Noah Hayes could feel it too. The old man's calm had begun to reshape the air around them. A staff vehicle turned sharply onto the main access road nearly 400 yards away, its movement controlled but urgent. Hayes noticed it first. Blake noticed the silence. The surrounding chatter on the radio net thinned out, replaced by coded acknowledgments and clipped confirmations. Checkpoint Alpha maintained position. A voice transmitted with crisp authority. Lock secondary lanes. Stand by. Blake frowned. We are already in lockdown. The reply came immediately. Negative. Full command authorization initiated. Hydraulic barriers along the western perimeter began to descend with synchronized precision. A pair of security gates nearly a quarter-mile apart sealed with a low mechanical resonance that traveled through the concrete like distant thunder. The old man watched the sequence without surprise. 3-stage containment, he murmured. That was not part of the original drill. Hayes swallowed. Sir, what is happening? The old man's pale blue eyes remained on the command building. They just remembered. Inside the approaching vehicle, General Kincaid sat upright, his dress uniform immaculate despite the sudden departure from protocol. Beside him, General Maddox reviewed a tablet screen displaying live feeds from Checkpoint Alpha. The image showed Lieutenant Blake standing rigid, unaware that the exercise he thought he was controlling had shifted beyond his authority. General Cole spoke quietly from the rear seat. He designed the blind wedges to test overconfidence. Kincaid gave a slight nod. And we just triggered one. The vehicle slowed as it entered the secured inner corridor. Soldiers along the roadway snapped to attention instinctively, confusion crossing their faces as they registered the presence of 3 general officers converging on a single checkpoint. At Alpha, the atmosphere grew still. Blake felt it before he understood it. The base was no longer simulating readiness. It was responding to something real. Hayes stepped back half a pace, eyes fixed on the approaching command vehicle. The old man stood with hands loosely folded in front of him, posture steady despite the years etched into his frame. As the vehicle came to a stop less than 20 feet away, the doors opened in precise sequence. 3 generals stepped out onto the sunlit concrete. Their polished shoes met the ground with quiet finality. The wind tugged at their jackets. No one spoke at first. The only sound was the distant hum of rotor blades and the faint tick of cooling metal beneath the afternoon sun. No one ordered the salute, yet every soldier within sight felt the shift in gravity the moment the 3 generals began walking forward. The afternoon light caught the silver stars on their shoulders, reflecting sharp flashes against the concrete like brief signals from another era. Lieutenant Carter Blake snapped to attention instinctively, boots locking against the pavement, chin rising as confusion tightened his expression. Corporal Noah Hayes followed half a beat later, heart pounding in his ears as the command presence closed the final distance. General Robert Kincaid stopped directly in front of the old man. For a long second he did not speak. His eyes studied the lined face before him, the steady posture, the familiar calm. The wind lifted the edge of the faded canvas jacket. "Mr. Monroe," Kincaid said, voice low but carrying across the checkpoint with absolute clarity. "Sir." It was not a question. It was recognition. General Stephen Maddox and General Henry Cole positioned themselves on either side, their bearing precise, their silence deliberate. Lieutenant Blake's pulse thudded against his collar. He had expected a correction, perhaps a procedural clarification. He had not expected 3 commanding generals standing at his checkpoint addressing the civilian he had just dismissed with formal respect. Monroe inclined his head slightly. "Good to see the walls still standing," he said evenly. There was no bitterness in the remark, only observation. Kincaid's jaw tightened briefly before he brought his right hand up in a crisp, textbook salute. Maddox and Cole mirrored him without hesitation. 3 generals, unmoving beneath the sun, saluting a quiet man in a worn jacket at an outer checkpoint. The motion was sharp enough to cut the air. Hayes felt the weight of it settle into his chest. Around them, every soldier within view snapped to attention in a chain reaction that traveled outward across the concrete, like a ripple through still water. Blake's face drained of color. He remained rigid, but his certainty fractured. Kincaid lowered his hand slowly. "Fort Ridgeline operates on the defensive architecture you authored in 1983, he said, voice controlled but edged with something deeper than protocol. Every response drill, every perimeter adaptation, every blind wedge mitigation." Maddox stepped forward half a pace. "We were concluding a briefing to honor the man who designed this system." Cole's gaze shifted briefly toward Blake, then returned to Monroe. "It appears the system chose to test itself first." The wind pressed the flag outward in a hard snap overhead. Monroe looked toward the surveillance tower again, eyes narrowing slightly, as if measuring the angle of light. "Overconfidence remains the most predictable vulnerability," he said quietly. Kincaid gave a single nod. "And today it was exposed." Blake swallowed, the realization settling heavily across his shoulders. He had enforced protocol exactly as written, yet he had failed to recognize the author of the rules themselves. The base around them remained in full command lockdown. Barriers sealed, gates closed. Movement halted across nearly 2 square miles of secured ground. Not because of a threat from outside, but because the foundation of its security doctrine stood at a checkpoint unrecognized. Kincaid turned slightly toward Blake, not raising his voice. "Lieutenant," he said evenly, "the strength of a fortress is not measured by how firmly it closes its gates. It is measured by whether it remembers who built them." The words settled without accusation, heavier than reprimand. Hayes stood silent, understanding fully now what the old man had meant. The system was never meant to keep people out. It was built to recognize who belongs. Under the afternoon sun, surrounded by reinforced steel and digital oversight, Fort Ridgeline remembered. The silence after General Kincaid's words lingered longer than any shouted reprimand ever could. The wind eased slightly, and for a moment Fort Ridgeline felt less like a fortress and more like a classroom where a lesson had just been delivered without spectacle. Lieutenant Carter Blake remained at attention, but something inside him had shifted. The certainty that had carried him through the drill had given way to awareness, and awareness carried weight. General Stephen Maddox glanced toward the perimeter tower that Monroe had referenced earlier. "Camera 3, he said calmly. "Adjust it 2 degrees right." A nearby communications sergeant responded instantly over the net. Within seconds the feed updated on the mobile tablet in Maddox's hand. The blind wedge disappeared. General Henry Cole allowed the smallest hint of approval to cross his expression. "Still sees everything," he murmured. Monroe did not smile. He simply observed the correction as if confirming a calculation. Kincaid turned slightly, addressing the assembled soldiers without raising his volume. "Stand down from full lockdown. Maintain internal review posture." Across the base, hydraulic barriers began to retract with controlled mechanical hums. Gates lifted. Secondary lanes reopened. The atmosphere did not relax, it recalibrated. Hayes exhaled slowly, feeling the tension drain from his shoulders. He understood now that what had just occurred was not disruption. It was verification. Blake finally spoke, voice measured and steady despite the heat pressing against his collar. "Sir," he said to Monroe, "I enforced the protocol as written." Monroe looked at him directly. "You did," he replied. "And that matters." The answer was not sarcastic. It was instructive. Kincaid studied Blake for a long moment before speaking. "Protocol exists to remove hesitation," he said evenly. "Judgment exists to refine it." The statement was not condemnation. It was expectation. A staff vehicle approached from the interior corridor, stopping at a respectful distance. A folded display board rested in the rear seat, prepared earlier for a ceremony that had been scheduled for the following hour inside the command auditorium. Maddox gestured subtly toward it. "We were about to present a commendation recognizing the foundation of this installation's defensive architecture," he said. It appears the ceremony relocated itself. A faint ripple of restrained smiles moved through the nearby soldiers, quickly suppressed by discipline. Monroe shifted his weight slightly, the years evident in the movement, but not in his posture. "Systems are only as strong as the people who question them," he said quietly. Hayes felt those words settle deeper than any formal address. Blake absorbed them as well, eyes forward, expression composed. Kincaid stepped aside just enough to clear Monroe's path toward the interior road. "Fort Ridgeline remains secure because its foundation still stands," he said. "We would be honored if you would inspect what it has become." Monroe glanced once more at the perimeter towers, the reinforced gates, the men and women standing straighter than they had minutes before. Then he nodded. The generals fell into step beside him, not ahead. As they walked toward the heart of the base, boots striking concrete in synchronized rhythm, Hayes realized something profound had just occurred. The drill had not failed. It had revealed not a weakness in steel or software, but a reminder etched deeper than any blueprint. A fortress does not prove its strength by closing its gates. It proves it by recognizing the hands that raised its walls. The procession toward the command building moved without ceremony, yet carried more weight than any formal parade. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement, stretching the figures of Elias Monroe and the 3 generals across nearly 20 feet of concrete, as if the past itself were walking beside them. Soldiers along the inner roadway stood at attention, not because an order had been shouted, but because presence alone demanded it. The hum of generators, the faint ticking of cooling engines, and the distant rotation of helicopter blades blended into a steady mechanical heartbeat that defined Fort Ridgeline. Lieutenant Carter Blake remained at Checkpoint Alpha until relieved, eyes forward, replaying every second in precise detail. Corporal Noah Hayes stayed beside him, quieter now, aware that what they had witnessed would be discussed long after the drill logs were archived. Inside the command auditorium, rows of uniformed officers stood as Monroe entered. The display board that had been prepared earlier was now positioned at center stage. It showed an original blueprint dated 1983, lines drawn by hand and pencil, annotated with careful measurements in feet and degrees. General Robert Kincaid stepped to the front, his voice steady and resonant without amplification. Fort Ridgeline operates on principles designed decades ago, he said. Redundancy, visibility, accountability, and humility. He gestured toward the blueprint. The architect insisted on one more principle that is not written in code or concrete. Recognition. Monroe stood beside him, hands loosely folded, gaze scanning the younger faces in the room. Some of them had been born long after the Cold War ended. Yet every one of them relied on a system he had once sketched across drafting tables under fluorescent lights. General Stephen Maddox continued. During today's drill, the system performed as expected. It detected deviation. It triggered containment. It escalated command presence. He paused deliberately. It also tested our ability to recognize experience standing directly in front of us. A quiet understanding settled over the auditorium. General Henry Cole stepped forward last. Security is not intimidation, he said evenly. It is discipline guided by judgment. Monroe finally spoke, his voice calm, but carrying to the back of the hall. A fortress is not built to exclude, he said. It is built to endure. He glanced briefly toward the doors, as if aware that Blake and Hayes were still outside completing their duties. Endurance requires people who enforce rules, he continued. But it also requires people who remember why those rules exist. There was no applause, only silence of a different kind, the kind that signals respect rather than uncertainty. Kincaid lifted a framed commendation, not grand in size, but precise in wording. It recognized not only Monroe's design of the base's layered defense architecture, but the doctrine that shaped it. He presented it without flourish. Monroe accepted it with a simple nod. Outside, the final status update cleared across the base network. Lockdown lifted. Drill concluded. Performance review initiated. The sun dipped lower, casting golden light against reinforced steel and glass. At Checkpoint Alpha, Blake looked toward the command building, posture straighter than before. Hayes adjusted the camera feed once more, confirming the corrected angle. 2 degrees made the difference between assumption and awareness. And across nearly 2 square miles of secured ground, Fort Ridgeline stood exactly as intended, not merely protected by barriers and code, but strengthened by the quiet recognition of the man who had once imagined its walls. Evening settled gradually over Fort Ridgeline, the sky shifting from hard blue to a muted amber that softened the edges of steel and concrete. The ceremony inside the auditorium concluded without fanfare, but its impact traveled quietly through the chain of command. Word moved faster than any official memo. By the time Elias Monroe stepped back into the open air, soldiers across the installation already stood a little straighter, aware that the afternoon had become more than a routine drill. The heat had begun to fade, replaced by a cooler breeze that moved across the 2 square miles of secured ground like a steady breath. General Robert Kincaid walked beside Monroe toward the outer motor pool, their pace unhurried. The design has held, Kincaid said evenly. Monroe glanced toward the reinforced vehicle barriers, now fully raised and aligned in precise symmetry. It was never about steel, he replied. Steel rusts. Judgment does not, if it is maintained. Behind them, General Stephen Maddox and General Henry Cole paused to speak quietly with a group of junior officers, their tone measured, instructive rather than corrective. Lieutenant Carter Blake stood near the edge of the parade ground, having been formally relieved from checkpoint duty. He waited, not summoned but compelled by something internal that demanded resolution. Corporal Noah Hayes stood several feet behind him, silent support rather than intrusion. As Monroe approached, Blake came to attention once more. Sir, he began carefully, choosing each word with discipline. I enforced the parameters as defined. Monroe studied him for a moment that felt longer than it was. You enforced them well, he said. But parameters are boundaries. Leadership is understanding when a boundary is a test. Blake absorbed that without defense. The afternoon's confidence had reshaped itself into clarity. Kincaid watched the exchange without interruption. There was no reprimand in the air, only calibration. Hayes stepped forward slightly. Sir, he said to Monroe, The camera adjustment is holding steady. Monroe nodded faintly. 2 degrees can change everything, he replied. A blind wedge becomes a line of sight. The wind lifted the flag again above the central command building, its fabric snapping sharply once before settling into a steady ripple. Across the base, lights flickered on one by one, illuminating watchtowers, corridors, and reinforced gates. Fort Ridgeline stood exactly as it had that morning, yet something within it had shifted. Blake finally lowered his voice. "I will remember," he said. Monroe gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "That is the purpose of a drill," he answered. "Not to prove strength, but to reveal understanding." General Cole approached, hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Monroe, transportation is ready whenever you are." Monroe looked once more across the installation, eyes tracing the lines he had once drawn decades ago on drafting paper measured in inches and feet, now realized in steel and stone across acres of secured ground. "It has grown," he said quietly. "As it should." Kincaid extended his hand, not ceremonially, but firmly. Monroe accepted it. The handshake was brief, deliberate, and equal. As the staff vehicle carried him toward the outer gate, Blake and Hayes remained standing beneath the evening sky. The fortress remained intact, not because it had locked down, not because 3 generals had arrived, but because it had remembered, and in remembering, it had endured. The outer gate of Fort Ridgeline stood open just long enough for the staff vehicle to pass through before the reinforced steel arms lowered once more with steady mechanical precision. The sun had dipped below the tree line now, leaving a deep violet sky stretched over acres of secured ground. Interior floodlights illuminated the perimeter fence in clean white arcs, casting long shadows that moved slowly with the evening breeze. Inside the vehicle, Elias Monroe sat quietly, the framed commendation resting flat across his knees. He did not look back immediately. He listened. The distant hum of generators, the rhythmic rotation of tower lights, the muted cadence of boots changing shifts. These were the sounds of continuity. At the checkpoint, Lieutenant Carter Blake remained in place even after his replacement had arrived. Corporal Noah Hayes stood beside him, reviewing the camera feed one final time. "Angle is stable," Hayes said softly. Blake nodded. "It will remain that way." The statement carried more than technical certainty. It carried intention. Across the installation, after-action reports were already being drafted. Not about procedural failure. About adaptive response. About leadership awareness. General Robert Kincaid stood near the interior steps of the command building, watching the taillights of the departing vehicle fade beyond the outer barrier. General Stephen Maddox approached quietly. "The system held," Maddox said. Kincaid gave a small nod. "It was never the system I doubted." General Henry Cole joined them, hands clasped behind his back. "You cannot train recognition through software," he said evenly. "It has to be remembered." The wind lifted the American flag again, its fabric snapping once before settling into a steady ripple. Fort Ridgeline had returned to normal operations. Gates aligned. Patrol routes resumed. Drill metrics archived. Yet the atmosphere felt recalibrated, as though the base itself had absorbed the lesson and adjusted its internal bearings. Inside the staff vehicle, Monroe finally turned his head slightly, looking through the rear window at the fading silhouette of the watchtowers against the darkening horizon. Decades earlier, he had measured those sight lines with drafting tools and slide rules, calculating response times in seconds and distances in yards. He had warned them then that overconfidence would always be the greatest vulnerability. Tonight he saw something different. Correction. The vehicle slowed briefly at the final civilian intersection outside the installation. Streetlights flickered on one by one along the quiet 2-lane road leading toward town. Monroe rested his hand lightly on the commendation frame, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that structures endure only when principles do. Back inside the perimeter, Blake removed his cover for a moment, running a hand through his hair as he looked toward the command building. "I thought strength meant never hesitating," he said quietly to Hayes. Hayes shook his head slightly. "Strength means adjusting 2 degrees when you need to." The tower light rotated overhead, casting a sweeping beam across the gravel trench and outer fence. The blind wedge was gone. In its place was clear sight. Across nearly 2 square miles of reinforced ground, Fort Ridgeline stood not merely secured by steel and code, but steadied by memory. And as the night fully settled in, one truth remained anchored deeper than concrete. A fortress does not endure because it locks down. It endures because it remembers who built it. Morning arrived quietly over Fort Ridgeline, the first light of dawn brushing the tops of the watchtowers in pale gold before sliding down across concrete and steel. The night shift rotated out with measured efficiency, boots striking pavement in steady rhythm as the day shift stepped into position. Lieutenant Carter Blake stood at checkpoint Alpha again, posture firm, eyes sharper than the day before. The air felt cooler, carrying the faint scent of dew settling across gravel trenches and perimeter fencing that stretched nearly a mile along the outer boundary. Corporal Noah Hayes adjusted the monitor beside him, confirming that Camera 3 remained aligned precisely 2 degrees to the right. The correction had become more than calibration. It had become a reminder. Inside the command building, General Robert Kincaid reviewed the overnight security logs with Generals Stephen Maddox and Henry Cole. No anomalies. No blind spots. No deviations beyond expected tolerance. Yet the conversation did not center on metrics. It centered on culture. Doctrine must be lived, not just archived, Maddox said evenly. Cole nodded. Yesterday was not about fault. It was about clarity. Kincaid looked out through the tall reinforced glass toward the outer gate, now fully operational under early morning light. Recognition, he said quietly, repeating the word that had anchored the previous afternoon. Beyond the perimeter, Elias Monroe drove along a quiet 2-lane highway bordered by open fields stretching wide under the growing sun. The framed commendation rested on the passenger seat beside him. He did not glance at it often. He did not need to. His focus remained forward, steady on the road measured in miles rather than yards. The hum of the engine blended with distant morning traffic, ordinary sounds that contrasted with the mechanical cadence of a secured installation. Yet, even away from the base, the principles remained the same. Awareness, discipline, adjustment. Back at Fort Ridgeline, a new group of cadets moved across the parade ground for orientation, their uniforms crisp, their steps synchronized but inexperienced. Blake observed them as they passed through the checkpoint for their first internal security briefing. He spoke calmly, voice controlled, instructions precise. Protocols exist to remove hesitation, he said. But hesitation is not the enemy. Misjudgment is. Hayes glanced at him, recognizing the echo of words delivered the day before. The cadets listened more closely than they might have 24 hours earlier. The story had already begun circulating quietly among junior ranks. Not exaggerated, not embellished, simply understood. Across nearly 2 square miles of reinforced infrastructure, Fort Ridgeline continued operating as it always had. Gates opened and closed. Radios transmitted coded confirmations. Tower lights rotated in consistent arcs. Yet something subtle had changed within its foundation. It was not visible in steel or software. It lived in posture, in tone, in the extra second taken to look twice instead of once. The fortress remained secure not because it had sealed itself from the world, but because it had recalibrated its perspective. And as the sun climbed higher, casting full daylight across the installation Elias Monroe once sketched on paper measured in inches and feet, one principle stood clearer than ever. Strength is not proven when authority arrives. It is proven when awareness stays. By mid-morning, Fort Ridgeline had settled fully into its rhythm, the steady cadence of duty replacing the intensity of the previous day. Sunlight reflected sharply off reinforced glass and brushed steel, casting precise lines of shadow across the parade ground. Lieutenant Carter Blake stood beneath the overhang of Checkpoint Alpha, reviewing a revised orientation brief displayed on his tablet. The language had not changed dramatically, but the emphasis had. Recognition, judgment, adaptive awareness. Corporal Noah Hayes monitored the live feed grid, eyes moving methodically across the perimeter sectors measured in degrees and yards. Camera 3 remained perfectly aligned, its field of vision clean and uninterrupted. Hayes adjusted nothing this time. It did not need adjustment. Inside the command building, General Robert Kincaid concluded a strategic review with Generals Stephen Maddox and Henry Cole. The agenda listed supply readiness, training cycles, and communication protocols. Yet the discussion continued to return to culture. We teach response time in seconds, Maddox observed. We rarely teach reflection. Cole nodded slowly. Reflection takes longer than a drill cycle. That is why it is often ignored. Kincaid looked down at the printed blueprint now framed and mounted temporarily in his office. Pencil lines drawn more than 40 years earlier traced the foundational layout of Fort Ridgeline. Every corridor, every tower, every reinforced checkpoint began as intention. It is easy to defend a structure, he said quietly. It is harder to defend its principles. Outside, a convoy of supply trucks entered through the main gate. Each vehicle processed efficiently under the calibrated security system. Blake observed the drivers, checked identification, verified routing codes. His tone remained firm, but there was a subtle shift in how he watched. He did not simply look for deviation. He looked for context. Hayes noticed it. "You are scanning differently," Hayes said under his breath. Blake gave a faint nod. 2 degrees, he replied. The phrase required no explanation. Beyond the base perimeter, Elias Monroe pulled into a small roadside diner nearly 20 miles from Fort Ridgeline. The establishment was modest, its parking lot marked by faded lines and morning light reflecting off chrome bumpers. He stepped out of his vehicle, stretching slightly as he looked back toward the distant horizon where the base lay unseen but remembered. Inside the diner, the smell of fresh coffee and warm bread replaced the mechanical hum of generators and rotating tower lights. He slid into a booth by the window, setting the framed commendation carefully beside him. The waitress glanced at it with polite curiosity. "Long drive?" she asked gently. Monroe offered a small smile. "Just far enough." Back at the installation, cadets gathered for their next block of instruction inside the auditorium. Blake had been asked to speak briefly about checkpoint protocol. He stood at the front of the room, uniform crisp, posture steady. "Security is not about proving authority," he said evenly. "It is about protecting purpose." The cadets listened in silence. Hayes stood along the wall, arms folded, recognizing the quiet evolution in his superior. Fort Ridgeline continued operating across nearly 2 square miles of secured infrastructure. Gates opened and closed. Patrol routes intersected at measured intervals. Tower lights completed steady arcs across gravel and fence. Nothing dramatic occurred. Nothing extraordinary. And that was precisely the point. The fortress did not need another lockdown to demonstrate strength. It had already learned what mattered. As the sun climbed higher over steel and stone, one truth anchored itself deeper than any barrier ever could. Strength is not measured by how tightly a gate can close. It is measured by how clearly those inside understand why it stands. The afternoon sun moved westward, casting a softer light across Fort Ridgeline as operations continued with steady precision. The cadence of boots on pavement echoed faintly along the central corridor, blending with the low hum of communications equipment and the distant rhythm of rotor blades turning above the training field. Lieutenant Carter Blake stood once more at Checkpoint Alpha, reviewing entry logs that displayed identification verifications measured in seconds and vehicle inspections measured in yards of clearance. Nothing was out of order. Nothing required escalation. Yet his attention carried a depth that had not been there before. Corporal Noah Hayes adjusted his headset slightly as a routine transmission came through the internal network. Perimeter clear. Tower rotation nominal. Hayes responded with calm efficiency, eyes scanning the monitor grid that now felt less like surveillance and more like stewardship. Inside the command building, General Robert Kincaid addressed a small group of senior officers gathered around the framed blueprint now mounted permanently along the east wall. The penciled lines, once fragile and theoretical, had become the skeleton of a living installation. "Every structure has a foundation," Kincaid said evenly. "What we protect is not just territory. It is intention." General Stephen Maddox stood beside him, arms folded. "Yesterday we were reminded that intention must be recognized in real time, not only in ceremony." General Henry Cole nodded. "Respect does not arrive with rank. It arrives with understanding." Outside, a training exercise commenced on the far side of the installation. Cadets moved through simulated checkpoint procedures, their instructors observing from measured distances. Blake watched briefly from his post before returning his focus to an approaching sedan cleared for authorized entry. His tone remained firm, but there was a new element in his posture. Patience. He studied the driver's identification, confirmed the routing assignment, and stepped back with a controlled nod. Hayes glanced at him with quiet approval. 2 degrees, Hayes said softly. Blake allowed the faintest hint of a smile. Always. Nearly 30 miles away, Elias Monroe finished his coffee and stepped back into the sunlight outside the roadside diner. The day had grown warmer, the air carrying the scent of open fields and distant pine. He paused for a moment beside his vehicle, looking toward the direction where Fort Ridgeline stood unseen beyond rolling hills and miles of asphalt. The framed commendation rested on the passenger seat, but his expression did not dwell on it. His satisfaction did not come from acknowledgement. It came from continuity. He started the engine, the steady hum replacing the mechanical cadence of the bass he had once designed. Back at the installation, the tower lights completed their arcs in disciplined rotation, even beneath full daylight. Gates aligned. Radios transmitted steady confirmations. The fortress functioned without disruption, without drama. Yet beneath the steel and stone, beneath the reinforced glass and digital overlays, something intangible held firm. Blake watched the horizon for a moment between arrivals, understanding now that authority was not the loudest presence on the ground. It was the quietest. Hayes adjusted the camera grid once more, confirming clear lines of sight across gravel trenches and perimeter fencing stretching nearly a mile along the outer boundary. Fort Ridgeline stood exactly as it was built to stand. Not because 3 generals had arrived, not because a lockdown had been initiated, but because those inside had remembered what the walls were meant to defend. And in that remembrance, the fortress endured with a strength measured not in steel, but in clarity. Late afternoon lights stretched long across Fort Ridgeline, turning reinforced concrete into bands of gold and shadow. The routine of the base continued with disciplined steadiness, yet the atmosphere carried a subtle depth that had not existed before. Lieutenant Carter Blake reviewed the daily readiness summary displayed on the internal network terminal beside Checkpoint Alpha. Response intervals remained within acceptable thresholds. Surveillance coverage held consistent across every degree of perimeter arc patrol rotations aligned precisely to schedule. On paper, nothing had changed. In practice, everything had matured. Corporal Noah Hayes leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes moving across the camera grid with practiced awareness. Each tower light, each gravel trench, each reinforced barrier represented more than infrastructure. They represented intention. Perimeter integrity stable, Hayes reported calmly into the headset. Blake acknowledged with a nod, his focus resting briefly on the horizon where the outer fence met open land stretching nearly a mile beyond the final checkpoint. He no longer watched solely for intrusion. He watched for context. Inside the command building, General Robert Kincaid stood alone for a moment before the framed blueprint mounted permanently along the east wall. The pencil lines appeared almost delicate against the glass, yet their precision had shaped 2 square miles of fortified ground. General Stephen Maddox entered quietly, pausing beside him. Culture adjustment is not measurable in seconds, Maddox observed. Kincaid nodded faintly, but it is visible in posture. General Henry Cole joined them shortly after, holding a training memorandum drafted that morning. We are integrating a new instruction block, Cole said evenly. Recognition awareness during protocol enforcement. Kincaid allowed a small smile. Then the lesson held. Outside, cadets completed their afternoon circuit across the parade ground, boots striking pavement in synchronized cadence. Blake observed them as they approached the checkpoint for simulated clearance procedures. His voice carried firm authority, but it no longer pressed with urgency. Protocol exists for consistency, he instructed. Consistency requires awareness. The cadets listened closely, absorbing more than regulation. Hayes adjusted the angle of a side monitor, confirming that every sight line remained clear. 2 degrees had become more than calibration. It had become doctrine. Nearly 40 miles away, Elias Monroe drove along a stretch of highway bordered by tall pine and open sky. The framed commendation rested upright on the passenger seat, sunlight reflecting softly across its glass surface. He did not dwell on the ceremony. His thoughts remained anchored to the living system he had left behind. He had never designed walls to impress. He had designed them to endure. Back at Fort Ridgeline, the sun dipped lower, bathing steel and stone. In a warm amber glow, tower lights prepared for evening rotation. Internal communications flowed steadily, measured and precise. The fortress functioned exactly as intended. Gates aligned. Patrols rotated. Surveillance arcs swept across gravel and fence in disciplined motion. Yet beneath the visible structure, something quieter had settled into place. Blake stood with hands clasped behind his back, gaze steady, understanding that authority was not displayed in volume. It was demonstrated in balance. Hayes removed his headset momentarily, listening to the ambient sounds of generators and distant footsteps blending into a steady rhythm. Fort Ridgeline did not require another test. It had already recalibrated. And as the final light of day softened against reinforced glass and concrete measured in feet and yards, one principle held firm within its walls. A fortress endures not because it resists the world, but because it remembers the purpose for which it stands. The night settled over Fort Ridgeline with deliberate calm, tower lights sweeping steady arcs across gravel trenches and reinforced fencing that stretched nearly a mile along the outer boundary. The air carried a quiet chill now, cooler than the afternoon heat, crisp against concrete measured in feet and steel measured in tons. Inside the command building, most offices had dimmed their lights, leaving only essential panels glowing in disciplined blue. General Robert Kincaid stood once more before the framed blueprint mounted along the east wall. He did not study it for correction. He studied it for continuity. The pencil lines drawn decades earlier had become living corridors, watchtowers, and gates that opened and closed without hesitation. Behind him, General Stephen Maddox and Henry Cole paused at the doorway. No words were needed. The installation was stable. The lesson had anchored. At Checkpoint Alpha, Lieutenant Carter Blake completed his final review before shift rotation. His posture remained firm, yet no longer rigid with untested certainty. Corporal Noah Hayes finished scanning the surveillance grid, confirming each sector displayed clear sight lines without blind wedges. 2 degrees remained exactly where they should be. Hayes removed his headset and listened for a moment to the ambient rhythm of the base. Generators hummed. Boots moved across pavement. A distant helicopter rotated slowly on standby. Nothing urgent. Nothing dramatic. Only endurance. Perimeter clear, Hayes said quietly. Blake nodded once. Maintain awareness. The phrase had evolved from command into principle. Across nearly 2 square miles of secured ground, Fort Ridgeline stood exactly as it had the day before. Gates aligned. Patrol routes intersected with precision. Communication channels transmitted measured confirmations. Yet beneath the visible strength of reinforced barriers and calibrated cameras, a deeper structure held firm. Recognition. 40 miles away, Elias Monroe pulled into his driveway as the sky deepened into full night. Porch light glowing softly against the quiet street. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment in stillness. The framed commendation rested on the passenger seat, reflecting the dim interior light. He did not rush to carry it inside. He understood what it represented, but more importantly, he understood what it did not. It was not proof of his worth. It was evidence that the structure he once imagined in pencil and measurement still honored its foundation. He stepped out of the vehicle and looked upward.